Blake Lively is smiling again. But here's what makes that interesting. These aren't just random family photos appearing on social media, right? They surfaced after one of the most explosive legal battles of Blake's career had already taken a dramatic turn, while the fallout from that battle was still producing new developments. Quill, on August 8th, Blake shared a rare glimpse into her family life with Ryan Reynolds and their children, featuring moments from a July 29th soccer match at Yankee Stadium involving Liverpool FC and Wrexham AFC. At first, there doesn't seem to be a story here. Blake is enjoying the day. Ryan is beside her. Their family is together, right? But then remember what Blake's name had been associated with for months? It ends with us, Justin Baldoni, legal filings, counterclaims, and a public fight that became so enormous that it stopped looking like it's an ordinary Hollywood lawsuit and started looking like a full-scale media war. Now suddenly, Blake is giving people something completely different to look at, and that's where the curiosity begins. Because the biggest courtroom showdown surrounding Blake and Baldoni never actually happened. The two sides reached a settlement in May 2026, before the case could reach the trial that many people had been expecting. So you might think that would be the end of the story, but it wasn't. Because while the main Lively Baldoni litigation was settled, another legal thread connected to the controversy was still producing headlines. Innate, and that detail changes the way you look at Blake's timing. Was she simply sharing a family memory? And almost certainly that's one possible explanation. No? But why did these photos attract so much attention? Andy, because Blake's public story has changed dramatically. Not long ago, every new development seemed to bring another accusation, another filing, or another argument over what really happened. Now the biggest visual we have is Blake sitting with her family, apparently enjoying a normal day. And yet behind that ordinary picture is a legal story that is much more complicated than the word settlement makes it sound. Because what exactly did the settlement end? What did it leave unresolved, And what happened with the other legal battle that continued afterward? Pondy. That's where the story gets interesting. Because the next chapter doesn't begin with Justin Baldoni. It begins with a name many casual viewers may have completely missed. Jed Wallace. Jed Wallace isn't as famous as Blake Lively or Justin Baldoni, but his name became important because Blake's legal battle eventually extended beyond the two stars at the center of It Ends With Us. Wallace is a crisis publicist, and Blake accused him of being involved in an alleged effort to damage her reputation during the fallout from the movie. Wallace denied wrongdoing, and this is where the story gets complicated, because by the time the main Lively Baldoni litigation reached its settlement in May, another legal question involving Wallace was still hanging over Blake. Then, in July 2026, a judge dismissed Blake's lawsuit against Wallace on jurisdictional grounds. Now stop there for a second. No, that phrase, dismissed on jurisdictional grounds, can sound much more dramatic than it actually is. It does not automatically mean a judge decided every allegation Blake made was false. It means the case was dismissed based on the court's authority to hear it. That distinction matters, because online, complicated legal rulings can quickly turn into extremely simple headlines. Blake Lively loses lawsuit, RICO. But real court decisions aren't always that straightforward. And this is exactly why the aftermath of Blake's legal saga is still worth watching. The main dispute with Baldoni had already ended in a settlement, but another legal fight had taken a different path, And for Blake, that creates a strange situation, The huge trial that millions of people expected never arrived. There was no jury verdict giving the public a definitive winner. There was no final courtroom scene that suddenly settled every argument surrounding the controversy. Ayo? Instead, one major case ended through settlement, while another related lawsuit was dismissed on jurisdictional grounds. And that leaves something the internet doesn't handle very well. Right. Ambiguity, because people want a clean ending. Right. They want to know who won, who lost, who was telling the truth, what really happened. But a settlement doesn't necessarily give the public those answers, and a jurisdictional dismissal doesn't automatically answer every underlying allegation either. Right, cool. So the legal story becomes less about one dramatic courtroom final and more about what happens after the cameras stop watching. Oh, that's where Blake's recent family photos become more interesting. Right? Because while the legal aftermath continued in the background, Blake was publicly presenting a very different side of her life, and Ryan Reynolds was right there with her, but Ryan's presence isn't just a random detail, his connection to the controversy became part of the public conversation too. Right. So the next question is unavoidable. After everything that happened, why does Ryan's appearance beside Blake matter so much? Ryan Reynolds has been beside Blake Lively through almost every stage of this public storm. And that matters because his name didn't remain completely separate from the controversy. Ryo. As the dispute surrounding It Ends With Us grew, Ryan's involvement, his relationship with Blake, and the way the couple handled the fallout all became subjects of intense public attention. So when Blake now shares a rare family moment with Ryan, people naturally look beyond the photograph itself. Oh, not because the picture proves anything, it doesn't, but because of the contrast. For months, the Blake Lively story was dominated by legal documents and competing claims. Now, the latest glimpse is much quieter. And that raises a more interesting question. Is this what moving forward actually looks like when you don't have a dramatic statement to make? There is no evidence that Blake posted these photos as some calculated response to Baldoni. There is no confirmed message hidden inside them. And there's certainly no reason to assume that a smiling photograph tells us what Blake is privately thinking. What we can see is much simpler. She is choosing to show a part of her life that exists completely outside the courtroom. And Ryan being there makes that image even more significant, because throughout the controversy, the two have continued to face public scrutiny together. That's important when you consider what happens after a celebrity legal battle. The case can end legally. The public conversation doesn't necessarily end with it. People remember what they saw. They remember the accusations. They remember the counterclaims. They remember which celebrities appeared to support which side. And even people who stopped following the story months ago may still recognize Blake's name because of it. No? That's the difficult part, A celebrity can stop talking about a controversy, but the audience doesn't have to stop talking about it, And Blake's challenge now isn't simply legal. It's personal and professional. Can she return to being discussed for her work rather than the dispute surrounding it? Vance, can a new project become bigger than the old headlines? Dear, can audiences eventually see Blake Lively without immediately thinking about It Ends With Us? And Mida, those questions don't have answers yet, and there is another reason this period has attracted attention. Blake's Hollywood friendships were called into the conversation during the controversy, including her connection to Taylor Swift, But there is no solid evidence that Taylor has anything to do with these latest family photos, and there is no reason to manufacture a feud simply because both names have appeared in the same broader conversation. The important story is Blake, her legal aftermath, her family, and what she does next. Because the most difficult part of this entire saga may not have been surviving the lawsuit. It may be rebuilding a career and public image after millions of people have already formed an opinion. And that is where Blake's next move becomes much more important than these photographs. No, yo, because a family photo can change the conversation for a day. A major career move could change it for years. Here's the part of Blake Lively's story that doesn't get discussed enough. He quote, "The hardest battle may not be happening in a courtroom anymore. It may be happening in the public's mind." You know, because when a celebrity becomes attached to a controversy this large, a legal settlement doesn't automatically reset their reputation to zero. People have already made up their minds. Yo, some believe Blake. Yo, some believe Baldoni. Yo, some don't trust either side. Yo, and plenty of people simply stopped following the story because it became too complicated. Right? That creates a problem that no judge can solve. How do you change a public narrative once it has already taken on a life of its own? Menda Blake doesn't control every headline. She doesn't control what people post online. I, you know, and she certainly can't control what a viewer remembers when they hear her name. Grohl, what she can control is what comes next. Her work, her public appearances, the projects she chooses, and to some extent, what parts of her personal life she allows people to see. That's why the recent family photos are interesting without needing to turn them into some secret message. They don't prove that Blake has completely moved past the controversy. You know, they don't prove that she's trying to repair her image, but they do show something very clear. The public is being given a glimpse of Blake outside the legal story. And that matters because celebrity narratives are built through repetition, right? If every new Blake Lively headline is about the lawsuit remains the center of her identity. But if the conversation gradually becomes about her family, her work, and what she does next, the balance can change, right? The problem is that Blake doesn't get to decide how quickly that happens, right? One new legal development can bring the old story back. One interview can trigger another round of debate. One new project can cause people to revisit everything that happened before it, no? And that is why the aftermath may be more unpredictable than the lawsuit itself. The legal chapter has become quieter. The public chapter hasn't, and there is a strange irony here. The more Blake tries to live normally, the more some people may examine those normal moments for clues. A photograph becomes a headline, a public appearance becomes a theory, a missing celebrity friend becomes a rumor. A smile becomes evidence of moving on. But none of those things necessarily tell us what is happening privately. And that's why the smartest way to read Blake's latest appearance is probably the simplest one. She was with her family because she appeared happy, because she shared a glimpse of that moment. Everything beyond that needs evidence. Still, the bigger question remains, can Blake eventually become bigger than the controversy that has dominated so much of her recent public image? Because if she can, these photos may eventually be remembered for what they actually were, not a secret message, not a legal strategy. Just an early glimpse of what life looked like after the biggest storm began to fade. But the real test is still ahead, and it has nothing to do with another court filing. It has to do with what happens when Blake steps back into the spotlight for her next major career move, and this is where Blake Lively's story becomes bigger than the photographs that started it. Right. Because the question isn't really whether Blake looked happy on July 29th. She did. The question is what happens after that moment. The legal battle with Justin Baldoni has already taken a path few people expected. Instead of a massive courtroom showdown, the two sides reached a settlement. The separate legal action involving Jed Wallace then added another complicated chapter, with Blake's lawsuit being dismissed on jurisdictional grounds. So there is no single courtroom ending that tells the public exactly how to interpret everything that happened. And maybe that's why the story continues to follow Blake. Because when there isn't a definitive ending, people create their own, oh? But Blake's next chapter doesn't have to be written by the internet, you know? It can be written by what she does next, you know? If her future projects succeed, the conversation could gradually shift. You know, if she stays out of the controversy and continues focusing on her family and career, the headlines may eventually become less about what happened and more about what's happening now. But if another major development emerges from the legal fallout, everything could change again, almost overnight, you know. That's the reality of celebrity news. One headline can erase months of progress. You know, one new document can reopen an old argument. No, and one unexpected appearance can make millions of people start asking questions all over again. Which brings us back to those photographs. Maybe they were nothing more than a family memory, right? Maybe Blake simply wanted to share a rare moment with Ryan and their children. Or maybe, without intending to, she showed the public something much more meaningful. That life continues even when the internet hasn't finished discussing the past. And perhaps that's the most human part of this entire story. Blake Lively doesn't have to convince every person watching her. She doesn't have to make everyone agree. She doesn't even have to make everyone forget. Eventually, the only thing she can really do is keep moving forward. And whether the public follows her there, that's the part nobody knows yet, So after everything you've heard, I want to know what you think, Do these new photos make Blake look like someone who has genuinely put the legal drama behind her? Blend, or do they make you even more curious about what happened away from the cameras? Mend, because one thing is certain, like the main courtroom battle may be over, but the Blake Lively story is still being written.